Welcome to Into
Sorry.
Theology, and this time we're both here. Last time we recorded and it was just me, which was
Sorry.
amazing. It was the best conversation I ever had, actually.
Yeah, with
Really
me at least,
wise and
after I
intelligent.
disappeared. Sorry, I'm an
Uh,
idiot.
well, we're back after, I think, about 2 months of hiatus,
It's
roughly.
been a bit of a hiatus. I don't know, has it been 2 months?
Well, I think we were in October 20, I don't know, 21st. It's, or sorry, August 21st. Yeah, about 2 months, actually. Time
Whoa,
flies.
wait a second. Okay, I'm gonna pull up the website here. When's the last time we recorded? It was, oh my goodness, dude, August 23rd.
Yeah. So rough, not quite full 2 months, but close to it.
Wow. Okay, didn't feel. I'm sorry. It's my fault. It's always my fault. But like,
Well, I was
just
busy too. I was teaching and all that. So I have a
yeah,
couple bonus episodes were released to kind of help uh catch people back up.
yeah.
Um, and you're featured in one of them, but also
Ooh,
the great Dr. Sean Wilhite is in the other one.
this is when you were teaching at Sembeck.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's a whole story, so I'll explain it later. But it didn't end up being Sembeck, but it's awkward to tell you the whole story on a podcast, so I'll tell you later.
Okay, fair enough.
uh, oh yeah, and we're looking at Thomas Aquinas's Summa, and we are in question 14 of book 1, which is on God's knowledge. And to kick us off, the Right Reverend Dr. Regis
Regis
Philbin.
Professor. Regis Philbin.
Ian Clary
Wait a
will be.
second. What does that make you? That makes you Kathy Lee Gifford.
Yes, of course. Whatever. She rocks. I'm not
She's a
ashamed.
Christian at least, so there's something.
Are you going to read, what is this, from Article
Yeah,
1 and the reply to Objection 2?
yeah.
Because
So
it's
we're
kind of a neat little summary and also goes into some kind of fun things about the categories of what knowledge is. So,
yeah, cool. Question 14, looking at the knowledge of God, which is, something like in all of these things, very difficult to kind of wrap our own minds around.
yep.
And so we're looking at the reply to objection 2 that Thomas gives from the first article. So if you're following along in the Peter Kreeft edition of the Summa, this is on the top of page 136. So, and this is just helpful because he's just kind of like explaining kind of how knowledge works. So in reply to objection 2, he says, whatever is divided and multiplied in creatures exists simply and unitedly, or exists in God simply and unitedly. Now, man has different kinds of knowledge according to the different objects of his knowledge. He has intelligence as regards, wait, sorry, did I say that right? Now, man has different kinds of knowledge according to the different objects of
Do you have
his.
intelligence?
Well, it was weird because it was like a capital H there, but
No, I know.
it should have said God's. Should I reread this?
I like how this is going. I think you should just carry
Thanks.
on. I think it's really clear and
Okay.
helpful.
So now man has different kinds of knowledge according to the different objects of his, that is God's knowledge. He has intelligence as regards the knowledge of principles. He has science as regards knowledge of conclusions. He has wisdom according as he knows the highest cause. He has counsel or prudence according as he knows what it is to be done. But God knows all these by one simple act of knowledge. Okay, so makes sense given what has already been said in the earlier parts of the Summa, in that God's simple and he's one. So that means that he can't have knowledge in any kind of like a divided fashion. So, I have knowledge of a tree and I have knowledge of a bird in the tree, and that's like two different kinds of knowledge that reside in my mind, and there's distinctions between them. But because God is simple and he's one, he can't have those kinds of distinctions. And so then Thomas really in much of this of question 14 is going to kind of be wrestling through, like, what does it mean for a simple being like God to know different types of things in a way that doesn't violate his divine simplicity? And so then that's basically what he's going to be addressing, especially in Article 1, but then throughout the rest of this section.
Mm-hmm. And in case someone's listening and says, "Oh, that was a podcast from 4 months ago," it's not as sharp in my mind as it could have been. A
Yeah.
really easy illustration for me is like if I have a coffee mug in front of me. For me to know this coffee mug, I look at it, I think about it for a little bit, I make a little image in my brain, and I've abstracted the shape of this thing from the actual stuff of it, so it gets separated and then recombined in my mind. It's a bit of a technical way to put something that's super straightforward. You see something, the coffee mug's in my brain, my mind, even though the real coffee mug's out there, but it's abstracted. I have the shape in my brain, my mind, even though the actual stuff is out there. So there's a sense in which my thinking is complex by definition.
Yeah.
God just knows stuff because he made it.
Yeah,
So I mean, that's a really basic illustration, but it kind of helps me to just think about how it's actually just common sense, even though the language makes it feel like it's really elevated.
yeah, it's like when you look at that coffee mug, that matter of the coffee mug can't reside in your
No,
brain, right? It can't go into it.
there's no
But the
porcelain in your
idea,
mind.
right, there's no porcelain or whatever, no coffee. But the idea of it does come into the mind, and the idea is
Right.
what corresponds to the thing like that, that's a form. And so you would say that the form of the coffee mug resides in your mind, and therefore then you
Right.
actually can know it. And so it's weird because like it's like, yeah, the mind abstracts it, it accesses that form through its matter, abstracts it into the mind, and then
Right.
that qualifies as what's called knowledge.
Yeah, you see something with your eyes, your brain organ kind of conceptualizes it, then your mind, your inner self sort of creates, I think he calls it a phantasm technically,
Phantasm. Yep.
but like it's just memory. So whenever you're thinking about a coffee cup, you know that the coffee cup might be at Starbucks, but it's in your mind in a real way,
Yeah.
just not actual plastic or fluid. So that's what
So I think
happens,
he,
but God
because
just
he
knows
defined,
everything.
I think he differ, like, because he talks about at some point, I don't think it's in here, but he talks about like various like senses in the soul, you know?
Yeah,
And so like he, the primary sense of the soul is what you just said there, common sense, right? It's like it's a knowledge that's spontaneous that just kind of enters into your mind. You just know, that something is
right.
a thing just by common sense. The phantasm is like is that image or the idea that of that object, so like you were saying, that actually enters into your mind
Yeah,
as a phantasm or an idea. And then, but imagination is a little bit different because imagination is actually like after the fact, or no, before the fact, where you can actually like think about
right.
something, you can
Yeah, there's
imagine
some
something to exist,
distinctions.
but it doesn't have to exist in reality. You can actually take two material things like a horn and a horse, and you can combine them in your imagination, and you can create a unicorn, but that unicorn doesn't exist in its own reality,
Which
right?
illustrates another thing that sounds really complicated, but is real simple for a second. So I can imagine a horse. It means that there's a real horse idea there,
Yep.
but it doesn't have to exist. Could just be
Exactly.
it could be
Yeah.
in a video game or something, you know.
Yeah,
So
but I mean,
there's a
like any
distinction
thought of
between
a horse, like I'm thinking, because you've used that term, it's like I'm thinking of a horse, but
right.
I'm not thinking of a particular one that I could know
But
or whatever.
there's a real shape, form, image in your
Yeah,
head, whatever you want to call it, and that image is real in a sense, but it doesn't have to exist in the in the material world. So there's
yeah.
a distinction between essence and actuality or existence, or possibility and actuality, or potentiality and actuality, depending on which terminology you want to use and how technical you want to be.
Yeah.
Um,
At there's like he has two other senses too, like at the level of like kind of things like judgment. So like being able to judge between good or bad, safe or harmful, whatever is what is called the estimative sense. So you can estimate, make estimations about things. And then memory, what you had brought up. Memory is something that like you have that image. So, I look at my coffee cup now, then I go home. The idea or the phantasm of the coffee cup, that sensory image is in my mind, and I can conjure it. I can think about it, and while that thing still exists, it's not present to me in the moment, but nevertheless, I have the idea of it still in my head, in my mind.
and if you're reading like a fiction book, everyone knows this. When you're done, you kind of imagine what happened, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
not
exactly.
it's real in the sense of it's a real imagination that you have, but it doesn't exist in the real world as we understand it. So there is a distinction there. We kind of went for a long time on this, but I just feel like sometimes I like to
Yeah,
remind
it wasn't
people.
even in the book itself,
Yeah,
so
I don't know why. I just feel like sometimes I read Thomas and the language that he uses sounds very technical, but when you just sit back, it's the most common sense thing in the world. That if I see a coffee mug, the real glass of the mug is not in my mind, but what's there is the image of it, the phantasm of it, and I've abstracted, in the literal sense, I've abstracted the image of the material thing itself, and therefore
yeah.
and I have to recombine it and all that kind of stuff. So it's
But
just,
that's with us, right? Like
yeah,
God is
so
not
God's
like
not
that
like
at
that.
all. Like
He's
God,
not
God
like that because
doesn't.
he has no sensor. Like he just not. There's no nose or eyeballs in God, so he
Yeah.
doesn't have to see the glass and then touch it to really know what it is. He just knows it already because he is the creator.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because it's sort of what Thomas gets into in here, where he talks about, I think it's here an article in the first article on 134, where he makes this kind of comment that like that the more material something is, the less knowledge it has. The more immaterial something is, the more knowledge it's capable of having, right? Because matter individuates like a form, right? So it limits these things. So a plant, which is entirely material, has form in terms of basic life, like its soul, but it doesn't have anything beyond that. So a form, the plant actually doesn't have any kind of knowledge. because it's most material. It is something like a rock is like even more material, has no knowledge whatsoever. But then you like move up this kind of like chain of life, and when you get to like animals, they have more immateriality about them, meaning they have a kind of greater knowledge that they can access the external world. Us with the rational soul, and then when you get to God, who doesn't have any matter at all, he's pure immaterial being.
Yeah.
Therefore, his knowledge is because he's not individuated by any kind of matter. That means he's technically
Right.
infinite. He's not limited, and therefore that it means his knowledge is then limitless.
You,
And
you know
he
what
does
this really
and because
reminds
he's
me of?
outside of space. Hold on, because he's outside of space and time. That means then that there's no that he's not like there's no before and after, meaning he doesn't learn anything, meaning he just knows everything instantaneously. He doesn't learn, he
Right.
just knows. And that's because he knows himself first, he knows himself exhaustively. And so when he knows things, he knows those things in relation to who he is.
This reminds me a lot of the modalities of what's the neo-Calvinist guy's name, the philosopher from Toronto, uh Durieverd.
He's not
He
from
has
Toronto. He was
well,
from
sorry, he taught there,
he
right?
was from Amsterdam.
Yeah, what, okay, sorry. He had this whole modality chart where he goes from like rock all the way up to God.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah,
Kind
the
of
modal
reminded me of that.
aspects. Yeah, modal aspects. And I mean, there's like to a certain degree, he's not wrong. I just don't appreciate the way he categorizes things. But
It's just not very memorable.
it's hard to keep in your
Yeah, it's
head
hard. It's
when
hard
the
to keep it
positives and
keep
the
in mind.
negatives and like what is going on here and how many are there and whatever. But let's not talk about Doivir.
So
Let's talk about
what you
Thomas.
just said though is something that Aquinas believes. Then he expands on it a little bit, because it's not the case that he just knows himself exhaustively, but he knows all of his own images or ideas exhaustively. So,
Yeah,
for example, on page 139, which is the 8th article, he has this analogy that God is the cause of all things, like an artist is of his art. You may think
yep,
of a painter in his painting. And then earlier he talks about how, in the page prior, how God has these sort of images in him of all things that he would make. And this is the first time I've ever seen this analogy would be in Origin of Alexandria, who was trying to say, look, all the things that are created, all the many things in this world, God already knew them outside of time before creation, because they were in him as you might say images or words, or logi is eventually what they're called. And it's sort of the Christian version of the philosophical idea that there are these, you might say, immaterial forms that bring shape to the rest of reality. Because what Plato and Platonists thought about kind of makes sense, but they really needed to know the personal God to really understand how the forms hold all things together, more or less. So it
when
seems
we
like
think
that's
about
kind of
it,
what he's getting at.
it makes sense, right? When you're thinking at the level of a form, like what does a form do? It's like a form acts upon matter to make the thing what it
Right.
is. A form is what? It's an idea. So if God knows things, he has these idea
Right.
of what things are going to be, and then it's causal, right? So his knowledge of something, which as Thomas says is like an act, like the act of God's intellect is his substance. And so when God is knowing something, he's acting on it to make it real.
Right.
And therefore then it's knowable, it's intelligible, it's a real thing.
What sort of reminds me of like Romans 1, where Paul says, basically anyone can know that God exists in his divine power, that he's the creator of all things through the things that are made. So I think so a lot of people realize there must be some power out there. There must be a creator because things are made, but they would often talk about it like Plotinus more abstractly, like the one, and then all these different forms and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, Christians by revelation know that that's God.
Yeah.
It's interesting too that Aquinas is very Augustinian in his understanding of knowledge of the future, God's knowledge of the future. How does he know the future? I mean, he says, for example, in 139 that the knowledge of God is the cause of things. It's what what God knows is. He'll continue to talk about contingency and free choice and all that kind of stuff. But the idea is that God knows the end from the beginning because he is outside of time, as you said, and all things are, what is the terminology? It's simultaneously present, I guess.
Yeah.
Boethius's thing. What does he say
Yeah,
again?
the notion of an eternal present.
Eternal presence. But he said all things are present to him simultaneously, eternally, or I can't remember. He has a phrase that's kind of famous. It's that idea. So Is Thomas Aquinas a Calvinist, or did he reject John Calvin's Reformation?
Sounds like he's actually a Molinist here, right? Because he
Okay.
knows contingent acts or contingent, things that are contingent. No, I mean, we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording, right? That there are some ways of kind of like viewing this that leads you into a kind of fatalism. And Thomas, I think, does a good job at like preserving against that. God knows all things as they actually are, but he also knows things in terms of the potentiality. And potentiality, at least in theory, can be limitless, right? Because
Right.
anything could potentially happen. And
In
as
this sense, God knows infinite things, like not in the literal like divine nature,
yeah, and because he know like so the idea that Thomas is going to kind of work through here is that like God doesn't know like all these individual things, and that's like the primary locus or source of what his knowledge is. The source of his knowledge is he knows himself exhaustively and in an
Right.
immediate sense, right? Like, I mean,
And
which is
in him are all
mind-boggling.
the images of all everything that's ever been.
And
Uh,
so by virtue of knowing
right.
himself exhaustively as like say the creator or the first cause, that means then he knows all of the effects or what he's made because he's the one that made them. And so therefore, of course, he knows all these various different types of things, all these individual things. But he knows them primarily as he knows himself in the most kind of
Right.
like pure, simple way.
Could I
And
give a
so,
terrible illustration?
oh, this will be good.
Yeah. So for
If you're
us,
actually willing to admit that this is a
yeah,
terrible one
it is
instead of all the
terrible.
ones that you pretend are
Uh,
great but actually
yeah,
are
yeah,
terrible, this
yeah.
will be
All the
good.
ones that I pretend are great are often terrible. So for us, something happens and our memory captures and we think backwards. It's almost like for God, his memory is everything that is.
Yeah,
It's like he remembers what hasn't yet happened from our perspective, but that's simply because he's outside of the order of space and time and all that kind of stuff. But we kind of think of like prediction, like God's thinking, like if there'd be a billiard ball that will hit another ball and go into a pocket. It's almost this sequence of events
yeah,
in time. But that's how we think about the future. And then we remember, like the way that we think of the past in terms of memory is it in a terrible way. The way that God just knows everything else. It's already there present in him. So he already knows, what will happen in 2024 and this and that because it's already known to him because he knows himself. And by knowing himself, he knows the images, the earlier Greek theology calls them the logi of all things, the rational structure of all things.
yeah.
And it's just present and knowledgeable to him. He knows the end from the beginning, even our contingent or free choices, as Thomas says in Article 13 on page 141. And interestingly enough, without exception, there might be some modern writer, but in the Reformed era, I can't think of any exception to a Reformed thinker who would disagree with that statement that
Hmm.
God knows our contingent free acts. They all affirm what we call uh, free choice. Um, Free choice, yes, free choice. There's a whole
The
distinction
decision between
there.
free will versus free choice.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah. But now the one exception I'll just say because everyone always brings it up is Martin Luther's on the freedom of the will. So it's actually
right.
called, I think it's actually titled on free choice in Latin.
No, Luther's is on the bondage of the will.
On the bondage. That's right.
Yeah, it
Sorry.
was Erasmus that wrote the freedom of the
Right.
will.
Okay, I might be a little tired, but I have another terrible illustration, so this will help.
But you got so many bags under your eyes right now.
I'm actually super tired. My wife and I decided, well, let's get up at like 6 a.m. so we can spend time with each other, before the kids get up, which
Yeah,
is great. But then I went to bed at like midnight, so now I'm like, oh, I'm dying at the end of the day. So great idea. It is a good idea. You should spend time with your wives. Just so you get tired. All I have to say is, in his argument is squarely against the idea that you can do acts of condign merit in order to receive a required reward from God. But he elsewhere will admit that of course you can do free choice in terms of going left and right and all this kind of stuff.
yeah,
His right hand man, Philip Melanchthon, the theologian of Luther, he might put it,
yeah.
definitely affirms that. So I think reading Luther trips you up because he's so polemical, but the Reformed in general affirm the freedom of human contingency, free choice, and it was also said to be enabled because God is the first cause of all of our choices. So God's
Right,
causality enables our causality. And the reason why, and I'll shut up after this, is because when you say that God is the first cause of all things, what you're really saying is he's outside of the order of space and time and of human causality. He's not a cause as we think of it. There's
Right.
no material
Yeah, we
causation.
only we can only actually here experience secondary or subsequent
You can only
causality.
experience. So whenever someone's trying to find like a God particle, or like, did God actually move the wind this way? You literally can't find that if you're looking at it for in terms of material. Like, you just see the material cause,
Yeah.
but that's because it's an invisible, immortal, eternal, outside of our order of space and time cause. Ergo, therefore, God can enable our free choice outside of our ability to comprehend causality. Because
Right.
we think, well, if God did this, then I did this. But that's not how it works. God didn't do that, so he did that. There's no way you can point that out. It's he is the first cause. That's all you can say, and therefore we're the effect of the first cause in every way. So even Aquinas really mentions that as God knows all things as the first cause, as the artificer of the art, and so on. He's making that similar point. But it's important to realize, because um, fatalism is bad.
Really bad.
It's a really boring way to live, that your choices don't matter, because it's usually pious sounding. Say, well, God's in control, so who cares? It's like, or God will just take care of it, so whatever.
Yeah.
What are you talking? I mean, why do you think the Bible is so full of warnings, encouragements, promises, punishments? Why in the world would God do all of that? And you're like, well, he uses, secondary, he does this means, but that's just for the bad people. I'm a Christian now, and God just does it. So everything's going to fail, or everything will succeed. It doesn't matter what I do. And you're like, well, you've really then just thought about things from God's perspective and forgot that you're a human being.
Yeah.
You shouldn't do that. It's
Yeah.
sort of, it's embarrassing, but it's also boring. And if you take it too far, it's pretty much the original heresy. Not quite the proto original heresy, but
Well,
it's
it can be.
the
It's like, well,
100s.
she made me do it,
Well,
Oh,
yeah,
God made me do it,
I was
Like,
thinking more of
woman,
like some
you
of the
gave
earlier
me.
Gnostic myths that removed
Oh, I
free
see.
choice. But you're right, yeah. So I know there's earlier ones like, did Christ come in the flesh and all that, but really early on, the 100s, Christians as a whole reject fatalism, and they don't stop.
Yeah.
Fatalism is viewed as, at least to them, a form of heresy. And I think I don't know if I want to use that word today, but it gets real close,
Yeah.
because it's an antinomian way of thinking, because your motivation is all gone. You just think you can't do anything.
I mean, God, like, you got to think about it, right? Like, God is all powerful, he's omnipotent. So that means then that he's capable of creating beings that are free moral agents that in no way violate his providence, his absolute control of things, right? So he can actually make humans that are in his image. And because we're his image, that means we reflect some of those characteristics of him, including things like freedom. Now, our freedom's not absolute, only God's is, but we have freedom. And we want to make distinctions between what do we mean by free choice. Like, when Luther's getting into like the bondage of the will stuff, he's talking about, like, he's not denying that like the will is free to choose a coffee over a cup of tea. What he's saying is that when it comes to like actually being able to like turn to God and actually like know God and be saved by him, that's something God has to do first, because we're sinful. And so that free will that we have has been affected by sin in this moral way, and that affects my ability to choose the good or choose God. But it doesn't affect other aspects of my
A
free will.
carpenter can make a perfect cut. He has the perfect knowledge of the math and the angle, and he
Yeah.
does, a good, the choice is right in that sense.
Yeah. And when it comes to like the question of like God knowing like future contingent things, like, so he knows things in terms of their actuality, but he also knows things in terms of their potentiality, because he created the material universe. And because matter is the place of change or becoming or potentiality, God knows every possible thing that can come out of any of
Right,
the
right.
matter that he created. And some of those things he will actualize himself to make real, but he knows all the other things that it could be. So it seems like when we think about the Molinism question, right, that God only has a kind of what is it, medio scientia, or middle knowledge, that it's almost like to the exclusion of the actual. And I don't think we want to do that. Like Thomas says on the bottom of page 141. So on his, I answer that for the
13.
13th article. The question is whether the knowledge of God is of future contingent things. He says, I answer that, since, as was shown above in answer 9, God knows all things, not only things actual, but also things possible to him and the creature. And since some of these are future contingent to us, as you noted, it follows that God knows contingent things, right? He knows
Right.
things that either it could be or not be. If you think about it, he has to. Like,
Right.
otherwise, you're just denying something about God in terms of those attributes that we've looked at, like he's eternal, he's
Well,
the
just
cause of all
clarify what
things.
you just said, because if you say he does not know what actually happens, but only what may happen, it requires that he is in the order of time as we are,
Right.
or similar to how we are, at least. He'd have to be part of the created order. So it makes him a creature by like, logical demonstration. So it is a problem. One of the interesting things, because I just taught on the doctrine of God, it's really interesting to me that the doctrine of eternal generation, procession, immutability, impassibility, omnipresence, and all these kinds of ones, they're all the same doctrine.
Right.
You
And they have to
like
be because
you
simplicity.
can't, right, simplicity, but like in the literal sense, you can't just deny one because you deny the others.
Right.
If God is not simple, then there might be a complex generation of the Son, and by inference, then God is parts, like cutting a
Yes.
salami in half.
He himself is
You know,
complex.
but that's not what the Bible says. It says God is one, according to Deuteronomy 6:4. So you have to deny that. So it's just really interesting that they're all the sort of the same doctrine. So you almost see this repeated in Thomas, like when he goes through all these different questions about God's knowledge, he's just saying the same thing, but applying it to a different question.
Yeah.
You know, God is simple applied to knowledge. So do you want to say something smart? I feel like
No,
I've been
I'm
rambling
looking
about
up
dumb
here
things.
in terms of like middle knowledge, right? So I'm just looking at a definition of it. So knowledge of the
Just go to Wikipedia.
futurables. Yeah, no, I'm actually looking at Bernard Vellner, however you say his name, his Dictionary of Scholastic Philosophy. So Molina and
You're
others
going to
concede this.
Wikipedia.
No, come on, give me Wikipedia. So I leave that to my students.
That's
No, I don't leave it to my students. They're not allowed to know. But it's this idea of it's a mode of a divine knowing that is intermediate between his necessary and free knowledge and between his knowledge of possibles by simple understanding and his knowledge of existence by vision. That's not helping me. So whatever.
we
But
can
it,
think
no,
about
it
it
makes
next
it,
time.
it makes sense, right? So what are we affirming? It's like God is simple, he's one. That means that the knowledge that he has is not a kind of divided knowledge within him. Why? Well, he knows himself primarily first and exhaustively. That means he knows himself as the creator and the cause of all things. So therefore, he knows those things because he is the creator of them. So his knowledge of himself is what
Right.
is the means by which then he knows
The-
the individual things of the creation. But that's not a violation of divine simplicity. It's actually a preservation of it.
Right.
And then and so because he's created this universe that has all the potentia within it, then he knows all the future contingencies of what that matter could or could not be. And he's the one who will ultimately be the one to actualize everything. So he knows it in its actuality or in terms of its being, but he also knows it in terms of what it could or could not be. And it's
Uh,
interesting. He also talks about how God knows evil things too.
I was about to
Um,
bring that up because that's kind
oh,
of an
were you?
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. What were you going to say?
Well, first of all, great minds think alike, and also terrible minds, so you just never know. Um,
Yep.
I just think
That's
it's
true. I never
interesting.
thought of that. Great minds think alike. Terrible minds think alike
Yeah,
too.
yeah. So the problem is like we might be the terrible minds. Right now, I feel terrible, but
I look
that's
terrible
actually
with this
bad news for
white,
you.
like this white sun, like the sunlight's just pouring into my office
Well,
right
that's
now.
your
I look like
angelic
Casper the Friendly
nature. You're
Ghost.
pure form, just like the angels are,
That's
and yet
right.
you know things was it complexly, unlike God who knows things simply, even though He's pure
That's
form.
right. 100% fine.
Yeah, we're like the only two people in our circles who can make that joke because it's so stupid.
No, it's so
The
smart that it's so stupid.
Yeah, yeah, the
And
problem is I
Ryan
feel
Hurd would
terrible and
probably come
sad
along
news.
and correct the
We need to get
joke.
Ryan Hurd to make these dumb jokes, but he would correct us. He'd be like,
That's not.
you missed
That's
this
not funny.
Latin article somewhere in or
Yeah.
preposition or something.
And then
Um,
we'd be blown away by it.
then we'd be like, whoa, there was the preposition of. It was from.
Yeah.
So evil is interesting. So he explains God knows evil. He has to know everything, but how does he know evil? Well, based on the nature of what evil is the privation of the good. It is the simplest way to put it is it's not doing what you know to be right. That's
Yeah.
what evil is. So you should respect human life, but instead you kick a grandma in the shin. That is not a new thing that's created. God did not create evil. Uh,
Sorry.
but you
So okay, go back to images and phantasms, right? I have the phantasm of you kicking an old lady in
whack. Why? What are you doing? Well, I've not reached the good. I privated the. It's an illustration, Grandma. I wanted to teach people about privation. So
Thomas jokes are the best jokes ever.
yeah. But I mean, that's just, I mean, it's a really good definition, because if you think, no, that's so silly, evil has to be, you can't say it's a privation, it has to be something. And then you ask the next question, okay, if it's something, what created that thing? And you're like, well, humans, and then that denies creation ex nihilo. God created everything out of nothing. And then if you say God, then you have to affirm that God created evil, but everything that is created is in God, and therefore evil is in God. So you're a big dum-dum.
Yep.
So you have to think about what evil is
But think of it,
based on all the things the
evil
Bible
is
says about
formless,
God.
right? It has no form, and we know things by knowing their forms. And so evil by definition is formless because it's a privation of that which is good.
Yeah, it's formless and void, you might say. It's So I think it's one of those things where the teaching that evil is a privation of the good, I think, trips people up. But then you have to ask the follow-up question: if evil is a thing in the world, who created that thing? And you really have to say it's God, unless you believe that humans can create things out of nothing. But if you believe that, that's a problem. Biblically, that's kind of outlawed.
Well, it'd make
And
you God.
and then if you say evil is in God, then you are in bigger doo-doo. You're basically a Manichaean at that point. Like, there's a lot of issues if you believe that. So really the only conclusion, based on when you read the whole Bible and you understand what the Bible says about God, you have to conclude that evil is not a created thing. Therefore, it's no thing, and yet it exists somehow, as Herman Bavinck says. So how does it exist? It exists in the mode of privation. It is not doing what is right. It is denying the good. It is, telling the truth is right, but you kind of give a half truth. We call that a lie typically. That's evil. It's not doing what is good.
Evil is like is a name that we give to something that actually kind of doesn't have existence, right? So it's weird in that sense.
The mode of existence of no thing. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
But you have to say evil.
weird.
So it's a weird semantic thing. You have to say evil's real, because it is.
Yeah.
You have to say it exists in a sense, but then you have to say, well, it's no thing, it's no substance, it's not created, it is literally no thing.
Yeah.
Most technically, it's the privation of a good thing, and therefore it has no existence. And yet it would be silly for us to be like so technical you can't just say evil's real, because that's just common sense. We have to have a way to talk about it.
Yeah, because when you think of it, right? If evil is a privation of the good or an absence of the good, so God is the good. So he's pure goodness itself. And any kind of movement away from him is something that would be described as evil. And evil in the most kind of absolute sense is that which is most far away from God, who's the good. But God is also pure being. So for something to be far away from God is something that moves away from being and into absolute nothingness. And so, like Augustine says in City of God, evil has no positive nature, but the loss of good has received the name evil. So it's just like it's a word we use to describe the loss of that which is good, or the loss of God.
Which is why I think evil, this is maybe an odd thought to kind of end on, but evil, when reflected upon, it makes you feel forlorn, like you've missed something.
Yeah. Well, it creates a disorder, right?
Creates a disorder. But there's something missing when you do evil, and I think that tells us, because we've not done something whole.
Yeah.
So a broken relationship tells you you haven't loved.
So it's interesting then, right? The way in the 10th article here on page 140, whether God knows evil things, he says, I answer that a thing is knowable in the degree in which it is. So in the degree of which it has being. And anything that has being has some sort of a goodness to it, because being is good. So he says, if a thing is knowable in the degree in which it is, hence, since this is the essence of evil, that it is the privation of good, by the very fact that God knows good things, he knows evil things also, as by light is known darkness. So, obviously I'm in a very lit up room right now, given like my face glowing.
Your angelic nature.
Right. Yes. But if I was
Ian sing.
That's right.
Glory to the new.
Very angelic. Casper the Friendly Ghost, maybe. But
yes.
Right.
So me, I'm super white.
Did we talk about Casper at one point on
we did, yeah. I can't remember. Probably I can't.
Might have been in the same context.
Casper was in the same context, maybe. No, it was like an illustration of something, and it was one that I gave. It was my one non-terrible illustration. It was just it didn't connect with the kids because no one watches Casper.
I'm trying to remember what this was now. See, now my memory's not working great. But if this room was completely dark, It would
Right.
just mean that there was an absence of light because darkness isn't a thing, but light
Right.
is.
You
And
know it
so
because you can
we can
infer what
know
the lack of it
darkness
is. Yeah.
by the absence of what we know to be light, right? And so in that same sort of way, it's almost like an indirect kind of knowledge where like God knows evil things, not because they actually exist, but because they're a privation, because he knows the good, because he knows himself, then he knows which is not good, which is not himself. And
Which is why
so,
the best way for us to know evil today is to know only good. And
right.
therefore, and the best way for us to know uh to know good in the future is to know only good and not evil. Not
Yeah.
even the absence is possible. So that'll be in heaven.
Can't
We'll
wait.
we'll
Make it
undo the
happen right
knowledge
now.
of good and evil at the tree and just know.
I was just thinking about actually, what would that tree have looked like? What was it? You know, like very weird. Like, what would it? I was like, okay, you eat this and you get this knowledge now of good and evil. I mean, obviously they know the good because they know God, so they have knowledge of good. And so, what would that knowledge of evil have been like? Like, I think in heaven, like in glory, we'll have access to that tree because our natures will have been perfected, and so there's like no, risk that in our free choice we're going to somehow choose the evil, which is what Adam does. But what was that tree? It's very, very kind of weird to think about.
Yeah, I think it's a tree that gave what it promised, but it gave complexity to our lives
Yep.
to the point that we now are unable to discern good from evil properly
Yeah.
until grace comes, and then by habit, Hebrews says we learn to discern good from evil, and thereby, in Paul's language, move from one level of glory to another until we no longer need to discern, but by habit, and then by resurrection, ultimately, the discernment's over. You just know good.
So
So in the
you just basically admitted that you don't think that Paul's the writer to the Hebrews.
I mean, I do think that. I guess I don't know that. I like Origins, only God knows kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that's like hip and cool. It sounds very mystical and smart too.
There you
Only God knows. I'm too pious to actually have an opinion. Uh, I gotta go, so we should end here. I felt like this was an interesting episode because I felt dumb the entire time, but
Oh, I think it was
okay,
good we were dealing with it. It was good.
okay.
So
Thank you for
okay,
the
so
encouragement.
in 2 months, then we're gonna deal with question 15.
Yeah. No, we should. Okay,
No,
so
next
before
week.
we
And
finish
next week is
recording,
just
I think
of ideas. I think that one's a short one, so we probably need to do,
yeah, next time we'll just do 15 and 16 next
yeah, let's
time
do
because
15 and
truth's
16 next.
relatively long.
Yeah,
And
enough
you know
for a
what?
good
We gotta
episode.
do 17 because it's on falsity as well. So let's do 15,
Oh,
16,
truth and fall. Yeah,
17.
makes
Yeah,
sense. Okay.
I think that'll be easy. So that'll be next time, and I'll
All right.
talk to you then.